May the words I share with you today be of the inspiration of Joseph, the dreamer, of Paul, the apostle, and of Luke, who recorded Jesus' words that sends us on our way. Amen. Amen. It was January the 15th, 1973. Trinity Episcopal Church in Buffalo, New York, one of the great historic downtown churches. And on this day, I began my spiritual journey as an Episcopal priest. Upon my graduation from the Episcopal Theological School, I returned to my adopted home in Buffalo to begin a new and innovative program sponsored by the Episcopal Diocese. I agreed to take on a project to provide shelter and counseling for homeless youth living in the streets of Buffalo. Many of these youth had been tossed out of their homes by their parents. We had a name for them that we actually created in those days. It was called the throwaways. They were simply thrown out of the house to live on their own. And upon my ordination to the diaconate, a few months before that date, I took over an old house to provide shelter, and I hired a staff to give those kids a chance to get off the street and find their own lives. And so began a program known today as Compass House. It's where kids find their direction. It's traditional, and certainly in the Episcopal Church, to ordain someone on a day in the saint's calendar. A lot of times this happens in January. And the bishop asked me which saint I like, and I said, well, you know, Martin Luther King was assassinated just a little bit ago, a few years, and his birthday is January 15th. And how about doing that day? The bishop said, wonderful. That's a great idea. And of course, he would be on our calendar not too much later than that. I asked also my prime mentor in my going through all the training to be the speaker, the preacher for that service. And his name was the Reverend William Wint, W-E-N-D-T. He was rector of a church called St. Stephen in the Incarnation in Washington, D.C., a place where I did my internship for several years. And I asked him to be that preacher, and we talked about it. He said he'd love to come, love to do that. We sent him an airplane ticket, or money for it. And I said, when you get to the airport, well, just give me a call, and I'll come pick you up. Well, we were having a big, this is the night before the ordination, having a big party, the bishop and some clergy and some others, all the participants in the service. But Bill never gave me a call. I began to worry a little bit. Did he forget? He did not remember this event. And then just before dinner was about to begin, I get a call from Compass House, an old little building, from the counselor. There were about 3 or 4 kids, I think, at the time. And the counselor said to me, well, this strange guy showed up at the front door. This is a secret location. I don't know how he found it. And he's here to see you and to be here, I think, for your ordination. And so we've got him here, and we had to get together and put our money together to pay the cab driver because he didn't have any money on him. By the way, that's the nature of Bill Wint. He lived his whole life based on God will provide me with whatever I need. And sure enough, the kids provided it that day. And we got into the party just in time, and I have to tell you, he was the life of the party, even coming from Washington. The service was quite unique in itself. We did a lot of things that nobody ever did in Buffalo before. We had birds attached to all the pews, doves, peace doves. We had unique music that nobody heard in a church service before. Remember, this is 50 years ago. And Bill gave a powerful sermon that I will never forget. And he even made a little reference to my future wife, because he knew her also from down past years. And just reminded me that when you're a priest married to someone else, your spouse becomes a priest as well. That's a pretty radical statement. And Bill was able to say that. So it was the service that had all the talk in the diocese back in the day. So from that beginning, I spent the next 4 years developing what turned out to be a successful program. When I began it, I had no idea where it was going and where it would head. Just starting from scratch with a little bit of money and an old house. Every day was different. There were adventures, always adventures. There was drama. There was danger occasionally. When you're dealing with people in the streets, you don't know what you're going to come up with. There were gangs. There were other people trafficking little girls. There were throwaways. And our job was to get them off the streets and help them find a direction. In addition to that, I did not have a church as such. I helped out in a lot of other congregations and sold my program, what we were doing. And Trinity Church was also sort of a sponsor, and I spent time there. There was a lot of support from the community, but I had no church as such. Some people always tell me, well, you really haven't been a priest until you had a church. And I'd say my church is the community right now. But I didn't get their point. I knew Kate for years when we were all lived in Washington, and she came back in 1976 to attend nursing school. By the way, I'm wearing a little color that's out of whack today. The baptisms we do white, the season we do green. But this is a stole that my wife Kate, who's right over here still, and she made this and sent it over the Pacific Ocean just for the occasion of that ordination. And so that's a pretty special stole. In 1976, we got married and decided we'd get a new start, a different kind of start. I'd take a church somewhere. Why not the West? Why not out here? And we were called to Wyoming. And I left Buffalo. You know I love Buffalo. I have to tell you that. A lot of people make fun of Buffalo, New York, because it snows all the time. But aside from that, it's a wonderful city. It really grew close to its people. And when we came out to Wyoming, the bishop said, I've got a place that would love you to, it's a challenging place. It's new, it's different, it's old at the same time. It's been around forever. But it's been closed for 2 years. 2 years. It's called the Little Snake River Parish. For those of you in Wyoming who've never been there, and that's most people in Wyoming, it's the towns of Dixon, Baggs, Savory, and a couple of other little oil camps spread along the river. It's a big parish boundary. It runs for about 120 miles east to west, and maybe 2 miles across. It's a river valley. And it started in the mountains behind Steamboat Springs, Colorado, ran down into Wyoming, came out of Wyoming, went back into Colorado, went back to Savory, went back to Dixon, went to Baggs, and then went out into the Red Desert and continued on. And it ended, the parish boundary literally ended at Dinosaur National Monument in Utah. So it really touched 3 states. How can you miss it? Great, beautiful scenery. So we talked about this being a place to go, and we called it a true cowboy country. And the cowboys are real there. These were guys who worked the land. They worked hard. Most of them were from, believe it or not, Peru and Bolivia. And they've simply come over to this part of Wyoming to find a real cowboy job. Made a point to learn from the locals there. By the way, Kate got a position as a nurse in Colorado, and then for the last couple of years we were there, she became the public health nurse in that valley. doing that, you get to know everybody. Between us, we pretty much did. The town of Dixon, where we lived in the rectory, had a population 50 years ago of 72 people. 72. And people were so happy to see us come, we changed the highway sign, went out, crossed it off, and put down 74. I was back there not long ago, we were there this summer, and it still says 74. 2 people replaced us. We spent 5 wonderful years there, putting the church back together again. And serving not only the church members, but the entire community. Because I always felt that is what the parish is. It's not just your people, it's everyone there. You serve them all. And one of the neat things that happened is we didn't have to force anything on them. We let them be themselves because they were a family just by being there. And they cared and looked after each other. It was a very special place. And if you've never been down there, go see it sometime. It's a time warp all of its own, even to this day. Church got back in action after the 5 years, but we decided maybe we should try something else. Oh, and I almost forgot to tell you, we had an office. And it was in the church parish hall in Baggs. Baggs is a big town, it had 140 people. And in that parish hall, we set up our offices, and we called it the Body and Soul Shop. Kid did the bodies, I did the souls. Worked out very well. As I said, the church got back in action after 5 years, but we looked around probably for something new and different. And I applied to be the rector of Trinity Episcopal Church in Lambert. In 1982, the year that we accepted that position, Lambert was a town facing economic depression and a very low sense of self-esteem. By the way, that's all different today. It's become more of a hip youth town now today. But in those days, it was depressed. And the congregation that we inherited was divided. We knew it was divided. The bishop told us, he said, watch out, it's divided. From old-time folks who didn't want to change to the new people who were coming in who did. And the older folks, they were a little strange. We tried to make it best for both. The older folks wanted a worship service with 2 things. No kids. No kids allowed. And the other one was no music. 2 things that you need to grow a church. And they wanted neither. They had to deal with that, but they also needed to deal with a whole new group, younger people who wanted to change, who were excited about the church. And so the job was to make a compromise where both could live together successfully. And we did. And it worked out quite well. The older folks gradually faded away, as will happen. We don't have any younger kids in music. And the new folks took over. And they were excited. They wanted new things. They wanted contemporary music, which we did. And they wanted community involvement. They wanted to be out there where the people were. And I love that. And they wanted educational offerings. We set up what was called an educational trust program to bring in outside speakers. People who could bring the world to that town, which was pretty well closed up. And we brought in, one particular person we brought in was a very big name in those days. This was the mid-80s. His name was Moorhead Kennedy. And he was an Episcopalian. His wife, Louisa, was as well. And they were known because they were 2 of the key hostages that were taken in Iran. And I know many of you probably go back to those days of remembering the Iran takeover. And his wife, Louisa, was on television all the time, trying to encourage people to put pressure on the government to get them out of that embassy where they were held captive. And eventually, they were released. We know that story, and I was able to get in touch with Louisa, and she and Moorhead come to Lambert just to tell what it was like to be a hostage, just to tell what it was like to be in the Middle East, and just to tell what it was like to be released and to work in behalf of peace in the Middle East. And he later started a Peace Institute in New York to help bring that about. So this was Lander, and we came along, we spent 7 years there. We also covered a little church up in Atlantic City, which is one of the most photographed congregational buildings in the whole country, actually. And then after 2 years being there, I agreed to also serve Shoshone Mission on the Wind River Reservation. And there I spent 5 years. 5 years of getting to know those people, getting to learn about Native American culture, Native American theology, and all the things that go with it. And I learned more from them than they ever got from me. It was a great 5 years in addition to Lander and Atlantic City. And both of our kids who were raised there, they're over here, Malcolm and Aaron, got to come in for this service. And they spent a lot of time growing up around not only Lander, but the reservation as well. And I think it was a good cultural experience for them. After 7 years was approaching, it came time to maybe move on again. And that's when I heard that another mentor of mine in this diocese, his name was Pat Keller. Some of you have heard of him. He was the rector here for 18 years. And he was a stable guy, and he was announced that he's leaving. And so I thought, well, Cody is a place that everybody thinks is wealthy and also has a dynamic congregation, and what a place to go. And so we applied. And the search committee decided they wanted to check both Kate and I out, and they sent 2 guys down to check us out. And they met with some people on a Saturday night, and then on Sunday they came to church. And when they came, everybody looked around at these 2 guys because they had suits and ties on. They never got the memo. And everybody said, oh, I wonder who these guys are. As it turns out, one of them is sitting right in front of me today, Bill Garlow, whose great-granddaughter, right? Great-great-granddaughter, who are going to be baptizing shortly. And the other one was our beloved Jim Hager, longtime organist here at Cody. And the 2 of them were so nice and polite. Everybody liked them. And then I got them even to go with me out to the Shoshone Mission when it was done. And we got out there, and those folks, we got to see them, meet with them, go to church with them. And I talked to Jim into playing their organ, which hadn't been played, I think, in a couple of years. I mean, it was a long time since they heard the old electric organ play. And so it was just a great visit. And guess what? They hired me. And that just made things all better. So this is the first congregation that I've ever had, I thought, that at least had some money. All the others you had to sort of sell things to make the budget. But here was different, or so I thought. Then I found out, big surprise, this church was in debt by $14,000 to the diocese. And it somehow that was never mentioned to me. There was an interim period. It didn't work out so well. That's why some people quit giving. But nonetheless, we got over that in a hurry because you in this congregation simply decided that we had to move on and go to new things. And that happened. And I need to point out that as I began my ministry here, I was also serving as the board president of the Wyoming Association of Churches, which is our council of churches at the time. Now it's known as the Wyoming Interfaith Network. And in that role, as president of the board, I had to be involved with the big news event of the day. And that was the proposed date for the execution of Mark Hopkinson. And many of you who go back to those years in the 80s, or the 90s, early 90s, remember all the news and stuff that came out about this man who was accused of arranging a couple of murders and was given a death sentence. And death sentence hadn't been there for years, 30 or some years since they executed somebody. And because we as the association had taken a position against the death penalty in all of our churches that were part of it, we had to say something about that in opposition. And I got stuck with the role of being the spokesperson for that little thing. It was a pretty perilous time, as my family remembers. A lot of unknowns, a lot of press, a lot of publicity. People were coming here to interview me and see what kind of church I was in because I was the spokesperson against them. And then it got even worse when I was asked to be one of the witnesses to the execution. It was a tough time, but I have to tell you, this congregation stood by me and stood by themselves because they understood that it was an issue that churches must deal with. It's like that reading you heard today from the letter that Paul put out. You have to put on the armor of God and be tough to deal with some issues in ministry. And that was one of the tough times. On January 22nd of 1992, Mark Hopkinson was put to death. I did serve as one of the witnesses, along with other unique people in the state. And in a sense, and I don't like this analogy very well, but we lost the battle over his execution. But we won the war, so to speak. Since that date, no one else has been executed in the state of Wyoming, and no one's even going to try. It's much too costly. So this was all being Cody. And Cody is a great deal. And by the way, Kate came along and joined the public health service and spent 30 years as a public health nurse here. And her nickname is the Queen of Flu Shots. Or she has another one too, called Painless Kate. Everybody would say, it's Painless Kate here, I need my shot. But that's part of the great experience of being at Christ Church in Cody. Christ Church was also a Cody that was open to all kinds of changes. One of the issues they were concerned about was mental health. Cody had a lot of mental health issues in those days that were not being addressed. And so we spent a lot of time working with organizations and groups to bring that about. We also made adult education a focus. I've always believed that even though it's important to educate your children in faith, you need to educate the adults as well, because it starts with them. And we did a lot of that. We did a lot of other programs. We brought in, again, an educational trust fund, bringing in outside speakers. And we had a lot of famous people came in here and taught, college professors, seminary faculty, and all kinds of people over the years to talk about issues the church needs to know about. And finally, we have one story I'll tell you about that. It's a story that my son Aaron experienced firsthand. He tells it better than I should tell me. One of my friends that I met down on the reservation was a fellow named Willie LeClaire. Willie today is a Shoshone elder, and he's known for his sweat lodges. He goes all over the state to prisons to do sweat lodges for Native prisoners. And I thought we'd go to get Willie up here to tell people about what it is to be a Native American person who is a leader, and the issues those folks go through. And I thought, well, a few people will show up here in Cody. I think there's a lot of interest. Willie came up, and to my surprise, everybody seemed to know who he was. And he put on a full-day program here at Christ Church talking about his life as a rodeo cowboy, as a Shoshone elder, as a spiritual mentor. People loved it. And the next day, I invited him to come and preach from this pulpit, to talk about that to the entire congregation. And which he did. And he had, of course, his full headdress. He came really in color. He was a sharp-looking guy up here preaching. And before that, just before that, before the service had started, it was the night after my son's Aaron's prom. He was out on the town all night, didn't know what was going on. Wanders back in the morning, goes into the kitchen, he says, First thing I see is this Indian guy sitting there with a headdress on, drinking coffee from the kitchen table. That was Willie. And he's very good about dressing up that way and letting people know, but then telling sharp stories. So those are the things we did. And they were some colorful things, and they were all good. And they're continuing under Mary's leadership today. When you're a rector who is about to leave, which I was, you always worry about the next person. They're going to mess up everything you ever did. And thankfully, Mary held firm. She's doing great today. So, to finish this long story, it's longer than my usual 7-minute sermon. So forgive me, please. But Bishop, our time, Bishop Bruce Caldwell, calls me up on the phone and says, "Hey, you've been very successful over in Christ Church after 14 years. And he said, I'd like to offer you another job. I got one for you. It's to be the director for that Wyoming Association of Churches that you once headed the board. They're having some troubles and we need somebody to get them back oriented once again." And he said, "I'll give you 3 years full salary." That was just when our foundation was coming in. We had lots of money. We still do. So anyway, he talked me into taking that position. And I've always said, in all my congregations, don't be afraid to leave while you're ahead. Leave while you're ahead. And when it's going good, that's the time to go. And I said, yeah. We talked it over, and we said, we'll do that. We'll still live in Cody, but I'll try this new job. I would lead this organization for the next 5 years. And this became a statewide ministry of a group that represented 12 denominations. And later it became known as the Interfaith Network, which it is today. And this exciting work, it was exciting. It took me all over the state as well as around the country. Our focus was on social and environmental justice. And we did some other things. For instance, I'd like to point this out. We started a campaign and led it for the most part for a number of years to take the state sales tax off of groceries, because that's an extra burden for those who are on the edge financially. It took us quite a few years for the legislature to finally get around and do that. And so every time you now go into a local grocery store or a state grocery store, remember that the Interfaith Network was responsible. We also led the opposition to casino gambling, which was plans to bring that in the state. And again, we won that battle in a statewide initiative, but we lost the war because my friends on the reservation got an exemption for their sovereignty rights. So all our casinos were on the res. And also, the last thing was the most recent thing was to protect the Red Desert of Wyoming. That place out there in the southwest part of the state that very few people know about, yet one of the most beautiful in the country. And we're working on that even today. So anyway, after this, and I'm going to end this now, 2009, I left that position to become a freelancing priest. Once a priest, always a priest. Remember that. The last 13 years, I've been doing God's work wherever called. I've served on an as-needed basis with other churches, based in Red Lodge, and on numerous state organizations, work with local community organizations. And I end by this. This past November, Kate and I received a special invitation to go back to Buffalo, New York, for the 50th celebration of Compass House. And I was honored as a founder of a program that has served, as of 50 years later, 14,000 youth have gone through that program, saved from the streets. It was a fulfilling moment. And when we began, I had no idea if it would all work out. But what I learned was that God is indeed in charge of things. And over that 50 years, I have come full circle. So here we are, 50 years later. What a celebration. I'm all pleased that you are here. I get to tell this story because it's one that makes sense after 50 years. And I'm thrilled that God has been with me through thick and thin over those years. And we we celebrate today, by the way, through baptism, which continues that kind of ministry. Because at baptism, you're not only made a Christian, but you're made a minister as well. This is where ministry begins. Every baptized individual, a minister of God. And I pray that that same Holy Spirit that guided me successfully over these years will be with her in an exciting future as well. As the scripture says, with God, all things are possible. So I thank you for bearing with me for a longer than usual sermon. And do come to the party that's going to follow for both of us.